In one of the biggest launches of a new company on the Australian Stock Exchange, or the ASX, in years, thousands of Australians have snapped up shares in Guzman Y Gomez, the rapidly expanding Mexican fast food chain. And for anyone who feels like this is a bit of a different language, don't worry, this podcast episode is going to be just for you. The ASX is where Australians are able to buy and sell shares of companies that have decided to be publicly listed instead of privately held. So what does that actually mean? And perhaps most importantly, will this change the structural integrity of my burrito? Maddy Guest from You're in Good Company joining us in the studio this morning. Maddy, so good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
I wanted to talk to you this morning about burritos, Mexican food. And the reason why is because Guzman Y Gomez has just floated on the ASX. It's been listed and it had an incredible day as its first day. It's now worth over $3 billion. What do we know about this company?
The biggest reason, Sam, why I love investing is because you get to dig into the stories behind the companies that are on the stock exchange. And when we look at fast food and Guzman Y Gomez in particular, it is all down to the man behind the business, a founder called Stephen Moat. So he grew up in New York. He talks about how he had quite a tough, upbringing. He had a drug addict dad. He had a brother who was legally blind. And he worked really hard, got a job in a hedge fund at the age of 23. And then at the age of 30, he was burnt out. And so he decided to move out to Australia.
Not an uncommon story.
No. And decided to move out to Australia. And what was missing when he moved out here, it was Mexican food.
Wow.
And so he started the business with a friend of his, also from the US, who had moved out here with an Aussie that they had fallen in love with, another classic story. And so they bought out chefs from Mexico and they opened their first restaurant in Newtown in 2006, closely followed by Bondi Junction. And today they have more than 130 stores.
And they're looking to have now over 1,000 stores. It's really interesting you mentioned that point about them bringing out chefs. There's been sustained criticism of the company since then for not being fully owned by people from Mexico and there being a sense of cultural appropriation in the way that they present the business. They've pushed back and said that there's really strong connections back to Mexico and the founder, albeit from New York, is proud of the company that he's built, clearly. And now it's gone from being a private company to a public company. Before we get back to the business itself, what does that actually mean?
So when a company is private, it is owned by a small number of investors. It might be the founders, it might be high net worth individuals, private equity, or even large institutional investors. But when a company goes public, that means it lists on the stock exchange. So for example, in Australia, we have the ASX, and that's exactly what Guzman Y Gomez has done.
So then what would the reasons be for the company to take that step from a privately held company to a public one?
I think the biggest reason would be access to more capital. And so
by capital, you mean money?
Yeah. So when you list on the stock exchange, everyday people are able to buy and sell shares in the company. And as a result, that company is able to raise more money to do more things. And so in this case, a big part of the growth story for Guzman Y Gomez is expansion. Right. They want to get more stores. On the flip side, when a company goes public, they are subject to a lot more regulation.
Right.
And so they have to report their financials at least half yearly. And I guess they're going to be under the eyes of investors. So people are going to be asking what is driving their financial performance, and if it's not good, why is that? Just under more pressure in general.
From an actual company perspective, sure, they get more cash, but does anything actually change about how they run?
When you go public on the stock exchange, it also provides what we call liquidity to the existing investors. And that means that they're able to sell some of their shares and get some money back. And in the case of Guzman Y Gomez, it's super interesting. They actually have investors that are related or connected to the founding group of McDonald's. And it's a super interesting group of people.
That's a really interesting point about McDonald's, obviously a major company, monetarily in world markets. I've actually seen some commentary that Guzman was calling itself the next McDonald's, and they were using that kind of success story to show investors what was going to be possible. But for consumers in the restaurant, if you're going to go down to your local Guzman tomorrow, does anything change for them now that the company is public?
Look, day to day, the answer is no. I think the biggest challenge for Guzman Y Gomez is going to be, as they continue to grow at this really rapid rate, are they able to maintain that really sort of tight company culture that they've referred to and really taken pride in the past? I've listened to the CEO and founder talk about how they currently have 180 stores. McDonald's has 30,000, and that's what they're trying to go towards. And so I guess you have to ask the question that if they have 30,000 stores, how are they going to be able to maintain that high quality that they really pride themselves on?
One other thing I've noticed in the reporting on Guzman going onto the ASX is the word moat and the idea that people were challenging whether Guzman had a strong enough moat. What does that mean?
So an economic moat is a classic Warren Buffett term. He's a very famous investor, and he always talked about how he liked to invest.
He's your crush, isn't he? Your hall pass?
Maybe my 93-year-old hall pass. He always talks about how he likes to invest in businesses with an economic moat. And basically what that means is if you imagine back in the day, you've got your castle that is surrounded by a moat with, alligators and water, and it's protecting from the enemies coming in and attacking the castle. So in this circumstance, what we're talking about is how is Guzman Y Gomez able to protect itself from competitors?
From being copied.
Exactly. What is stopping another Mexican store starting up and being just as good or better and expanding in the same way that Guzman Y Gomez has?
Have there been any major criticisms or concerns from the investment community as this company's been talked about over the past few months?
So I think we've talked about probably the two biggest and most important, which is, do they have a strong economic moat and the valuation? But the other ones that I have been reading about are around supply chain. So we know that inflation continues to be quite high and there are quite a lot of flow-on effects to supply chain. Guzman Y Gomez really prides itself on, using free-range chicken, the highest quality food, all these great inputs.
At a low price.
At a low price. And yet you have to ask the question that with these sort of more macroeconomic headwinds, is that going to make it harder for Guzman Y Gomez to be successful in the short term?
Everything is going up and consumers constantly are looking for something cheaper. And if you position yourself as cheap, it's hard to kind of keep up with that race. So yesterday, everyone gets very excited because for the first time ever, you can buy shares in Guzman. It floats on the ASX. By the end of the day, so markets close at 4 p.m, what happened to the share price and what does that tell you about how investors are feeling?
The stock listed on the stock exchange at a price of $22. People seem to really like this share. It was up over 35% in one day. It's a great result. I'm sure everyone involved in the business itself will be very happy. People like their burritos.
I also think there's an argument to be made for when a really visually appealing and visually familiar brand lists and people just kind of want to be part of it because they've had a burrito once a week for the last couple of years and they want to be part of the journey.
I think that's the interesting thing about investing, right? Is you can have this business where all of the fundamentals tell you one thing. And by fundamentals, I mean financials. How much money is it making? What are the costs involved? On the flip side, if people really like the brand, if people engage with it, then they kind of want to invest in it because they want to benefit financially from the way that they're interacting with it day to day. And so sometimes we see these circumstances where analysts and finance experts might be saying one thing, the company's only worth this much. It's outrageous that they're valuing it that high. And then on the flip side, when it does list on the stock exchange, there's so much hype and people love this company so much that they don't care and they invest in it anyway.
So if you want to buy stocks in Guzman now, and we're not giving financial advice,
No.
but more just as an idea, if you want to buy stocks in Guzman now, have you missed the boat?
So I think when it comes to investing in businesses like this, when they're in this stage of infancy on the stock exchange, you really have to think about what is your risk tolerance. Because if you love risk and you love tacos, maybe this is a company that you want to do your research in and invest in. But if you are, I guess, more risk averse and you want to let it play out a bit, this company is going to be listed for a long time.
Yeah.
And so you can sit and wait and let it kind of settle and then invest down the track once, I guess, the adjustment to what we call public markets settles down.
Really interesting. I can't believe that, there's so much money in good Mexican food.
$3 billion apparently.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today, Maddy. And thank you for joining us this week on the Daily Aus. Maddy's actually got her own podcast. It's called You're in Good Company. Really awesome financial discussions. I'll throw a link to that in today's show notes. We'll be back again on Monday morning. Until then, have a wonderful weekend.